I'll just lean over. I guess my neck is too long. And I'm also very clumsy. Anyway, I guess we're starting. Hope everyone had a nice lunch. I'm Carol Hess. I teach here at UC Davis. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Beth E. Levy. She's an associate professor of musicology here. She's also the vice president of the Society for American Music, in which she has been very active. Her book, Frontier Figures, American Music and the Mythology of the American West, received the American Musicological Society's Music and American Cultures Award, the Society for American Music's Irving Lowen's Book Award, and also an award from the Penn Center, USA. And her contribution to the volume Aaron Copland and His World won the 2005 Irving Lowen's Article Award, and I know that because I was on the committee. Her research interests include ecomusicology and the community and historical pageant in California, and some of you may remember another specialization of Professor Levy's. She gave a paper some years ago at the AMS, which was one of the few papers I've ever seen the whole audience just in stitches laughing. Why? Because it was on music and the Marx Brothers. She's currently working on a book about the outdoor grove plays of the San Francisco Bohemian Club, from which her talk from this conference has been drawn. And the talk, of course, is From the Redwoods to the Riviera, the Bohemian History of Joseph Redding's Fay-Yen-Fah from 1925. Let's welcome Professor Levy.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Pierre, and everyone for putting this conference together. I feel very privileged to be part of this distinguished group. Before I begin, in addition to the land acknowledgement that you see printed in your beautiful programs, I want to acknowledge that the redwoods in question, the redwoods that you see here, lie on the traditional homelands of the indigenous peoples collectively known as the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo. In other papers, I have discussed how the indigenous stewardship of this land has been too often elided and erased, including through the symbolic processes of the so-called grove plays that I will discuss. While that is not my topic here, I feel that the roots of a kind of playing Indian at Bohemian Grove also underlie the Orientalist representations that I will be discussing this afternoon. American opera history is studded with oddities, one-offs, and exceptional cases, elliptical satellites orbiting around the supposed centers of operatic performance. One such satellite is Joseph Redding's Fay-Yen-Fah, which premiered at the Opera de Monte Carlo in 1925, but which began life as an outdoor musical play called The Land of Happiness, performed by the all-male, almost all-white Bohemian Club in a redwood grove north of San Francisco. Better known to musicologists as the librettist for Victor Herbert's Natoma of 1911, Redding is considered the founder of the Grove play as a genre, the first to provide a unified score for an entertainment that had previously unfolded as a multi-authored hodgepodge of vignettes. While that first Grove play was an exercise in Native American fake lore, the 1917 production, The Land of Happiness, represents the club's first and most significant Orientalist Grove play. In this paper, therefore, I shed light not just on a forgotten opera, Fay-Yen-Fah, and a little-known genre, the Grove play, but also on the ways in which the privilege present in these unusual operatic contexts fostered a species of West Coast Orientalism that, as Mina Yang and Nancy Rao have shown, was more ethically and aesthetically complicated than the Orientalisms that circulated in European and East Coast opera centers. First things first, the Bohemian Club. It was founded in 1872 as an association of newspapermen and like-minded artists. Just to be clear, it never had anything to do with the Czech Republic, and although its members aspire to carefree bohemianism, it took only a few months for the club to gravitate toward the wealthiest segment of society. Yet, to an extent that may be unique among elite men's clubs, the Bohemian Club prides itself on its music making. In addition to their totem animal, the owl, and their motto, "Weaving spiders come not here," the club identifies with the Redwoods, where they have gathered annually since 1878. Functioning like a fraternity resort, Bohemian Grove has hosted many of the country's richest and most powerful men, including, as you may have read this past summer, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, one of the few black men on a Grove guest list that has included every Republican president from Calvin Coolidge to George W. Bush, alongside cabinet members, bankers, and captains of industry. Herbert Hoover was a member for more than 50 years. Apart from Lita Miller, scholars of the arts have by and large ignored the Bohemians. The club's concentration of power has sparked sociological research, however, and a spate of conspiracy theories, most notably from Alex Jones and InfoWars. His hyperbolic interpretations are false, but understandable, given some of the club's peculiar rituals. Most notably, the cremation of care ceremony, which involves burning in effigy the burdens of the workaday world. The dramatic high point of each summer encampment is a Grove play like The Land of Happiness, which gave birth to the opera Fay-Yen-Fah. Written and composed by club members, the Grove plays draw together elements from opera, operetta, and the melodramatic underscoring of silent film. These are plays that trade in stereotypes. I offer both apology and fair warning for some of the content I will discuss here, which is racist in its imagery and in its connotations. I hope it will be obvious that I offer these images in a spirit of critique rather than celebration. The performers of the Grove plays are primarily clubmen as well, quite often men with serious cultural and political influence, who have joined the obligatory ranks of Grove play supernumeraries as soldiers, priests, peasants, tree spirits, and, when called upon, ladies in waiting. Every club member is expected to carry a spear for the good of the production. A brand new Grove play is performed each year. In addition to calling attention to the forest as a special or sacred place, most of these early plays feature villains who resemble evil spirits and heroes who are sensitive to nature or the arts. Female characters are necessarily few and far between. There are a lot of processions up and down. It's a very steep canyon stage, as you can see here. And so there are a lot of processions up and down the hillside, often allegorized to represent some form of progress between the human and the divine. While conventional stage props and indoor scenes are avoided in this context because they tend to look ridiculous beside the huge trees, larger-than-life special effects are the Grove play's stock in trade. In fact, after a particularly effective scene in the 1904 Grove play, The Hamadryads, it seems to have been expected that Grove plays would culminate in some kind of dramatic arboreal illumination. These conventions were firmly in place by the time that Charles Templeton Crocker approached Joseph Redding to collaborate with him on The Land of Happiness. Templeton Crocker was the scion of the Central Pacific Railroad family, grandson of Big Four railroad man Charles Crocker, not incidentally the one most associated with the exploitation of Chinese labor. He was also the nephew of Bohemian Club member William H. Crocker, who was the founder of Wells Fargo Bank, and a boyhood friend of Joseph Redding in Sacramento, where Redding's father was the mayor. Though surviving correspondence between Redding and the younger Templeton Crocker dates only from 1915, they were almost certainly already acquainted through Redding's own work as attorney for the Southern Pacific Railroad and through the social ties between the Crockers and the family of Redding's wife, Myra Cowles. It makes perfect sense that Templeton Crocker, a newcomer to the Grove play genre, would think of old hand and family friend Joseph Redding when seeking a composer. But why the Chinese setting? In fact, the club had already made a number of Orientalist forays, including, among others, a Pan-Asian Buddha-themed entertainment in 1892, in which Redding himself participated. When longtime Bohemian George Tisdale Bromley was named U.S. consul to Tianjin in 1884, the club held an elaborate celebration advertised as a Chinese miracle play, during which Redding served as comic interpreter and, according to the club annals, quote, half a dozen Bohemians costumed as Chinese with gongs, horns, cymbals, drums, and fiddles, banging and clashing, squealing, braying, and rattling, marched into the room and up onto the stage, end of quote. 25 years later, when two club members returned from their trip to China as members of the delegation of the Pacific Coast Chambers of Commerce, they were greeted with a similar deluge of Orientalist stereotypes and what was described as a real Chinese band. Conceived just a few years later, Redding and Crocker's Grove play picks up where these less formal entertainments leave off, taking the slim trappings of firsthand experience and dressing them up in lavish costume. Surviving materials suggest that Templeton Crocker was an enthusiastic Orientalist before he began writing The Land of Happiness. Certainly, his family had decades of contact with Chinese labor, en masse, working on the railroad, and in the more intimate contexts of domestic servitude. Here he is in January of 1912, dressed for an Oriental ball that he staged at the St. Francis Hotel for 200 guests. As recent scholarship has noted of other key figures, including numerous Bohemians, Crocker's Orientalist embrace was likely coded gay, at least to some observers. Amy Tsuyoshi writes that in the 1910s, quote, "The Oriental became a vehicle through which white men could forge otherwise illicit sexuality amongst themselves," end of quote. Perhaps an outgrowth of this strategy, Crocker's choice of China also represented a significant departure in Grove play tradition, as was frequently noted in the press. Society and clubdom were on the tiptoe of expectation, not just because of the unusual subject matter, but also because the play promised to be, quote, "the costliest production ever staged under the magnificent trees of Bohemian Club Grove." Crocker paid Redding $20,000 for what both men agreed would be 2 years of continuous labor. Given that Crocker was worth approximately $5 million in 1898, growing eventually to at least $15 million, this was perhaps a reasonable arrangement. I must forego any detailed plot summary, and I will merely point out that The Land of Happiness corresponds to Grove play traditions in pitting the evil fox god who casts his fearful shadow over all old China, represented by the superstitious tutor Tin Hua and the aging viceroy Wang Lu, against the bold youth Xiunin, who returns from studies in the West, defies the fox god's fear-mongering, and pursues a forbidden union with the viceroy's daughter, his childhood sweetheart, Fay-Yen-Fah. The fox god takes revenge on the free-thinking Xiunin by killing Fay-Yen-Fah in an intoxicating poppy dance, which was choreographed by Balanchine when it reached Monte Carlo. And after the intrepid Xiunin has burned down the fox god's temple, the two lovers enjoy a transfigured reunion, courtesy of the goddess of happiness and the powers of her sacred peach tree. Just to get the music in your ear, I'll play a clip now from a 2009 production. Note that this is actually the indoor opera, Fay-Yen-Fah, not the outdoor Grove play, which is entirely private. In fact, what I will share with you is something of a vanity production, maybe relevant in that way to our conference theme. Many of the male singers are Bohemian Club members, and they essentially rented out Monte Carlo's Salle Garnier to do their own mostly amateur restaging. They made their own set. They bought their own costumes from Chinatown in San Francisco. They rehearsed on a cruise ship and at a villa in Tuscany. The footage is from a documentary film of the whole affair, produced by Alex Hendricks. You'll hear Trey Costerison as Xiunin singing in a kind of glee club operetta style, which I'll then ask you to contrast with the more starkly Orientalist style of the music of old China, the Viceroy, sung by Bohemian Eric Stratman. quickly, I think. In the libretto, the narrative arc of cultural improvement is more generational than racial, with solely Chinese characters and a legendary setting. In his 1917 note on the music, however, Redding's rhetoric is markedly Orientalist. He refers to the quaintness and lilt of Chinese pentatonic melodies, and as Mina Yang has noted, the drama culminates in a blazing C major explicitly representing the diatonic triumph of Western choral harmony over the pentatonic solo singing, repetition, imitation, and rhythmic counterpoint that Redding believed were traditionally Chinese. If there is an element of cultural authenticity here, it has to do with Redding's ideas about texture and his specifications about percussion, both of which drew in a limited way from his firsthand experience of the Chinese opera that could be heard nightly less than a mile from the Bohemian city clubhouse. While Yang is entirely right to object that the instrumentation, language, and music bear little resemblance to Chinese opera, Redding's awareness of Cantonese opera performance practice, together with the melodramatic nature of the Grove play, allowed him to at least evoke the role of improvised percussion as backing for vocal recitation. You can see some of the recitational style at the bottom of the slide here. Impresario and Bohemian Club member Doc Leahy would later tell a newspaper reporter that, compared to Redding's score, quote, Puccini's music for Madame Butterfly is as thoroughly Italian as a Naples love song. From the start, Redding and Crocker had a professional opera premiere in mind, yet it took them more than 6 years to find a stage, and when they did, it was 6,000 miles away. How this came about is a tale I have only partially untangled, but the main players seem to have been dramatic soprano Mary Garden, Redding's semi-estranged wife Myra, and the U.S. ambassador to France, Myron T. Herrick. According to the San Francisco Examiner, Garden, who remained friendly with Redding after creating the title role of Natoma in 1911, requested permission in 1921 to stage Fay-Yen-Fah with the Chicago Civic Opera. This never came to pass, and indeed, the Reddings had privately agreed the year before that Garden was perhaps too old for the part. By December 1921, however, Myra Redding and Ambassador Herrick were in negotiations with impresario Raoul Gunsberg, then feuding with the Prince of Monaco over the budget of Monte Carlo's Saul Garnier. In this opulent indoor setting, Fay-Yen-Fah transformed and even in some sense reversed the Grove play's original gender politics, but retained and intensified its upper-class connotations, such that when Fay-Yen-Fah returned to San Francisco as an opera in 1926, it was the society event of the year. In particular, the opera required a large budget because of its extravagant costuming, the subject of countless letters and memoranda about sizing, fabric, and trim, and, tellingly, because of the special effects baked into the opera by virtue of its Grove play lineage. The magical peach tree, whose withered trunk bursts into bloom during the closing conflagration, presented unique challenges that Gunsberg was quick to single out for complaint in his correspondence with Myra Redding. There you can see. Indeed, one critic at the San Francisco premiere reported that the eminent set designer Giovanni Grandi of La Scala, quote, suffered a mishap with his peach tree, in which the golden flowers that were supposed to shower down upon the transfigured lovers instead got caught in other stage machinery. There's the tree as it appeared in San Francisco. Of course, the most notable transformation that the Grove play underwent en route to Monte Carlo involved casting. The appearance of 13-year-old Kenneth Cook as the original Fay-Yen-Fah had been greeted in the press in 1917 with a riot of gender anxiety. He is all boy, is Kenneth, the San Francisco Chronicle noted, being a swimmer, baseball enthusiast, and all-round athlete, as well as being an accomplished pianist and remarkable dancer. He had a great aversion to donning girls' clothing for the land of happiness, but finally consented when he was assured that many of the members of the Bohemian Club had often appeared in the habiliments of their fair sex. By contrast, the reception of the eventual prima donnas, Fanny Heldy in Monte Carlo and Lucy Bertrand in San Francisco, was blissfully serene in its embrace of stereotyped femininity. One critic in Monaco exclaimed, "Where could one find anything prettier or more charming than Fanny Heldy in this role of Fay-Yen-Fah, the little Chinese princess? She performed with a delicacy of expression that could not be surpassed." Bertrand, who replaced Heldy in the last Monte Carlo performance and in San Francisco, was feted not so much for her singing as for her appearance, with critic Ada Hannafin describing her as, quote, "a charming little actress endowed with a piquant type of pulchritude and a winsome personality, capable of embodying the timid, dainty, and unsophisticated little daughter of old China," end of quote. Critic Redfern Mason echoed these sentiments, calling her, quote, "a picture of Oriental submissiveness and beauty." Apart from being translated into French, much of the Grove Play script was left intact. Fay-Yen-Fah's role, however, was completely redone to expand and to bring it better into line with existing operatic conventions. Her chorus of handmaidens acquires a newly active role within her now indoor and sumptuously decorated apartment. She gains a new scene of supplication and an expanded love duet that had originally featured only very modest singing in response to Xiaonin's passionate outbursts. You can see here that some of Xiaonin's text has actually been given to Fay-Yen-Fah instead, in addition to some new text written specifically for her at the bottom of the slide on your right. The music as well was altered, and the next clip that I will play for you, featuring soprano Melody Moore, juxtaposes simpler music drawn directly from the Grove Play, what you see on the left, with the soaring lines of the now expanded love duet on the right, suggesting a very rapid character development from timid maiden to powerful heroine. Many elements of Fay-Yen-Fah and its reception conspired to shift the balance of the opera's gender dynamics away from the masculine brotherhood of the Land of Happiness. Consider, for example, the retitling of the score to highlight its heroine, the addition of a crucial indoor scene, as you see here, and the detailed attention in the press to the costumes both of Fay-Yen-Fah and of the female members of the audience, a number of whom wore supposedly Chinese attire. What remained, and I would argue facilitated this transformation from Grove Play to opera, is a Californian Orientalism that was fluid in its gender associations and entrenched in San Francisco's high society, where the upper classes embraced very early what historians Mari Yoshihara and John Kuo-Wei Chen have called popular or performative Orientalism. More than in Boston or New York, the Californian elite chose to look east in search of what was locally obviously to the west, actively placing the exotic other at the farthest possible distance. The sites at which this Orientalism was performed, and that is to say, the performances I have discussed today, including the Grove Play, the Monte Carlo production, and perhaps especially the idiosyncratic DIY revival of 2009, were never marginal in terms of social power and prestige. On the contrary, all three were animated by the privileges of consumption and the entrenched pleasures of freewheeling Orientalist, frankly racist representations. These contexts were, however, remarkably fluid in their gender politics and in a mixing of amateur and professional aspirations. It is in this fluidity that I find the strongest connection to our conference and its theme. What the journey of Fay-Yen-Fah from the Redwoods to the Riviera and back again teaches us is not so much that this sort of social center cannot hold, but that what it does hold still has some potential to surprise and to unsettle us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are questions for Beth. I'm sorry, I have a bad leg today, so if I go loping across the floor.
This is a comment and a question, or maybe two comments. I'm working it out. The first thing is my spouse was a member of the Bohemian Club as a music maker and told me lots of stories about being in various Grove plays with many of the people who were on some of your earlier slides, and I'd love to talk more with you. Yeah, just getting a very weird oral history of a secret men's club is very interesting. But I guess the thing that is a maybe question, comment that I'm still working through is I'm fascinated by these kind of overlapping performances of masculinities all throughout this that in some places seem like they would be contradictory to each other, but are not. So like this sort of 1920s outdoor sort of, very rooted in different types of, fascist understandings of being men outside in this space in an all men's club, but also performing Chinese as a way that could be understood and read as gay, and how that there's a sort of situation of homosociality, like somewhere in between these two. And I'm just interested in your thoughts about these kind of really interesting overlapping masculinities that happen in the Grove plays.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very rich and complicated mix. So it's absolutely a safe space for these men to experiment with different kinds of homosocial connection. It's because it's a living tradition. It goes. These outdoor performances go back to the 1870s. And so there's also an inherited tradition by the time we get to the teens, the 20s and 30s, that is at play with what's going on in the world around. So there is the culture of strength and masculinity and getting back to nature, but there's also scouting. That's part of the originary moment of this. There's also even, the kind of Rooseveltian, you go to, here we are in the West, and you go outside and make your campfire, and it makes you a better man. So it's really, really complicated. But certainly there was little doubt that Templeton Crocker and many of the other performers, they were fairly out for the 1900s, for the 1910s. And they were very prominent in club circles. And so there is also a sense, it's a refuge, it's a private space, and then men get to play with men in a lot of different complicated ways.
Thank you.
One more question, perhaps? Oh, dear. Now there's going to be a fight. Okay. Tekla, I'm sorry, I saw your hand go up first. We'll have a long dinner period where we can ask lots of questions.
All right. Thank you, Beth, for this really wonderful paper. I'm intrigued by the idea of the magical peach tree because it almost seems to contradict the whole Bohemian Grove concept of celebrating the redwood trees, and here they are giving the magic to a completely different kind of tree that isn't even there in the grove. So was this based on some actual Chinese tradition or legend, or was it maybe a symbol of their great redwood trees, but they had to make it a peach tree to orientalize it a little bit more?
There are some other examples. I have tried to ascertain this. I've talked with Nancy Rao. I don't think the peach tree is a real thing. I think they just made it up. But there's also, there's a Johnny Appleseed play in 1946, and then it's apple trees. So I think that it's an instance where the power of club tradition, because these are amateurs, right? Templeton Crocker is not a professional playwright by any means. Where the power of inherited tradition, like they know they have to have the forest lighting up and some kind of tree magic at the end. And so it's not tacked on exactly, but I think that it's a testament to the power of the inherited club traditions rather than a gesture at authenticity, or even like I don't think it matters that it's a fruit tree or something. I'm really only seeing it as a kind of calcification already in 1917 of certain aspects of this grove play as a genre. I might be wrong, and so if others know of legendary peach trees that I should research, please let me know.
Thank you very much. I think what we'll do is move on to the next speaker, and then if at the end we have time before the keynote, we'll take, the speakers can answer any remaining questions.
Certainly. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Christopher Morris. He's professor of, I almost said president. He's professor of music at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, and he's author of Reading Opera Between the Lines, Orchestral Interludes and Cultural Meaning from Wagner to Berg. That was from Cambridge in 2002. Also, Modernism and the Cult of Mountains, Music, Opera, Cinema, that came out in 2012 with Ashgate. And he's also written lots of chapters and articles on opera and on topics in music for the screen. His third book is called Screening the Operatic Stage, Television and Beyond, and it will be published in the Opera Lab series of the University of Chicago Press in March. Morris is co-editor of the Opera Quarterly, so I guess if you're planning to send him an article, you might buy him a drink later tonight.
Ask me nice questions.
And today, we're very lucky to hear his paper on a topic that surely affected all of us in recent years: business as usual, opera and screen media after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to Pier Paolo for the invitation, and his team for working so hard to accommodate us and make us feel welcome, put everything in place for us. Great pleasure to be here at this event. And I suppose I'm, like Nina, experiencing waves of revision internally as I listen to the papers as they unfold. That's probably a good sign. That's a good reason to participate in an event like this in the first place. This research emerges from my forthcoming book. One of the problems with writing a book about contemporary media practices is how quickly your material can become out of date. Which is to say, if you want to find out what was hip 5 years ago, read an academic account of it now. And so I was prepared for this, I suppose, and part of my response to that is to try and address some topics that are in effect updates, and in some cases slight rethinks about some of the topics I cover in my book. One of the recurring themes in the press coverage of the filmed version of the musical Hamilton is whether it is in fact a film. Shot at live performances in 2016, this production, directed by Thomas Kail, who was also the stage director, was acquired by Disney and released on the Disney Plus streaming platform in 2020. Wrote Vulture columnist Mark Harris, quote, "The talk about what is and isn't a movie can get really tedious," unquote. but apparently not tedious enough to prevent him from going on to explain how this version of Hamilton was shot at live performances using an array of cameras and edited in such a way as to embrace the live, quote, stage show quality of the musical. He concludes, quote, "This is not an attempt to turn Hamilton into something it isn't. It's an attempt to share with you what Hamilton is," unquote. Interviewed about the production, its editor, Jonah Moran, elaborated on the importance of generating a sense of the live event, including framing it with introductory audience bustle, and a request by one of the actors in character that the audience turn off mobile phones. Moran said, quote, "Having that in was an important part of saying, this is the theater. We're watching what happened on these nights," unquote. Meanwhile, Thomas Cale, that's the stage and video director, stressed the need to find a grammar for the production, and he went on to explain that while the 9 cameras afford a range of perspectives, these must be deployed and edited judiciously with a calculated, narrative-driven use of close-ups that respects the staged event as staged event. For those of us in opera studies, and perhaps even for those who simply take an interest in opera on screen, this language has a familiar ring, because it echoes the discourse that has long attended commercial videos of staged productions of opera. Speaking on a panel event devoted to the Met Live in HD series a decade ago, multi-camera director Brian Large defined his practice in polite, collegial, almost deferential terms. The key, he informs us, is respect for the production. Gary Halverson, director of over 100 Met Live in HD productions and hundreds of episodes of sitcoms, including Friends, puts it this way, quote, "Precisely because I have directed a lot myself, including all those sitcoms, I have respect for what the opera director does. The production is separate from me. It is done for the stage, period." And Jonathan Haswell, a director of multiple productions for the Royal Opera House's live cinema season, acknowledges the potential contradiction of an intervention that seeks to conceal itself. He says, "I see my job as to generate engagement and to attempt, and I know this is naive of me, but to attempt to do that in a way that appears as though there is no mediation. I want to become totally invisible," unquote. This is language that arguably undervalues, maybe even deliberately obscures the sometimes powerfully mediated intervention in the work of multi-camera directors of opera broadcasts. But it may tellingly reflect the compact at work in these productions in 2 ways. First, as Halverson's comments suggest, these attitudes need to be situated within a wider televisual discourse. In a classic text that has stood as one of the manuals of television production, Desmond Davis wrote in 1960, quote, "The best technique highlights that which is important, eliminates that which is unimportant, and obliterates itself by its own perfection," unquote. Second, multi-camera directors may express a desire for invisibility, may seem, that is, to assume willingly a role marked by service to others, but it is also the case that the nature of the agreement between broadcasters and opera companies dictates the status of their work. The default value has always been discrete surveillance, a mode of production further facilitated in recent years by the introduction of remotely operated cameras. This partnership has amounted to a form of permission granted by the host. Set up the cameras and microphones as unobtrusively as possible and record a live event, which will take place whether this apparatus is present or not. These are the terms of engagement. if engagement is even the right word, for what is an afterthought to an already complete stage production. The result? A modesty of ambition supported by a rhetoric of deference and fidelity to the real thing. The real thing is being in the opera house, of course. Hamilton on screen immediately became a streaming sensation, generating record-breaking viewing statistics. This is arguably the moment when the conventions of the screen stage and its televisual grammar entered a wider discourse. But of course, the success owed something to extraordinary circumstances. Originally scheduled for release in cinemas, it was instead debuted as a stream when cinemas, like theatres, were forced to close their doors. We hardly need reminding that the lockdowns imposed in response to the global pandemic all but suspended public gatherings, and any cultural form predicated on the assembly of audience was drastically impacted. Catapulted into crisis management mode, opera companies reached for alternatives to performance in front of audience, and they found one via the screen. Planned stage productions were hastily adapted to social distancing guidelines and live streamed. Companies with archives of transmissions made the content accessible, often without charge. New projects were developed with cameras and microphones in mind. Wasn't this, one friend and colleague asked me at the time, a moment when opera on screen became a thing? At the time, I answered with a qualified yes. On the one hand, it seemed to me that creative thinking was being channeled with unprecedented intensity toward projects that were either conceived specifically for screen or that seemed to break out of the old mold of multi-camera production based on virtual audience perspectives of the opera house stage. So, for example, what we might call digital shorts took on a new prominence as companies began streaming them in lieu of live performance. Witness this example from my own neck of the woods. I don't expect you to read the text, but this is a series of 20 short productions that were released online during lockdown. And Yuval Sharon, who's come up already today, his Götterdämmerung adaptation, Twilight Gods, doubly responded to restrictions with a site-based drive-through production that was itself filmed and streamed, and witnessed the example of Philadelphia Opera, which was widely praised at the time for responding in a very innovative and positive fashion with screen-based productions. And was even praised in the New York Times for having, as the headline says here, kept faith with the innovations it introduced during the pandemic. I began to wonder if opera producers might be emboldened and raise the bar for audiences typically fed a diet of unadventurous screen productions, content with the notion of capture. Maybe, too, this was the beginning of a screen culture that would actually coexist with opera in the opera house and not merely relay it. The introductory text in Twilight Gods stream reads, "At a time of profound crisis, the gods' destruction brings a new day." Would these words prove prophetic? On the other hand, it seemed possible that all this was only going to last only as long as the lockdowns, that it would be a case of business as usual once theatres reopened. Some of the initiatives, for example, the split-screen Zoom-style collages from performers' homes, were of course hasty improvisations and came across as what the New York Times described as, quote, "the best we can do under the circumstances," unquote. That some of the larger institutions fell back on the virtual safety net of their video repository exposed the limitations of the established model of transmitting or streaming stage productions. What happens when the supply from the stage dries up? Even a substantial back catalogue was quickly exhausted when the Met offered its nightly streams. Its response was to simply keep cycling back through the list. Here, surely, were the perfect hothouse conditions to germinate a nostalgia for the opera house predicated on resentment toward all these screens, which would now be tainted by association with dark days. One stream in particular illustrated for me the anxiety generated by the pandemic, while also hinting at ways opera companies might challenge the all too modest ambition that I've been associating with opera on screen. Not in this case by turning to made-for-video production, but by rethinking how the staging of the opera in the opera house might engage with screens. Faced with the prospect of cancelled public performances of its new production of Falstaff in December 2020, the Bayerische Staatsoper opted to present the production instead on its own streaming platform. No audience was in attendance, but this hardly registers when the Staatsoper's in-house cameras capture the stage. After all, the convention, as we know, is that the audience, or anything other than the stage, doesn't figure once the performance is underway. As it has been doing for over a decade, Staatsoper.tv models its undistracted gaze on the imaginary figure of the always attentive spectator, the same spectator for which the now empty opera house was designed. In this case, though, stage director Mateja Kolesnik adapted the closing scene of the production expressly for the stream. For once, stage direction and video direction worked in partnership. At the moment, Falstaff, sung by Wolfgang Koch, protests that the world would be a dull place without comedians like him. The music comes to a sudden halt. Falstaff, or is it Koch, glances wistfully to the auditorium and walks silently off stage. Only then does the music resume, the cast for now hidden backstage. When the singers do reappear, it is not in person, but on a large monitor. They have swapped their costumes and wigs for their street clothes and now appear in split screen as though participating in a Zoom meeting. There they will remain for the remainder of the performance. I'll play you a couple of excerpts from this. to the fugal finale, Everything in the World is a Jest. As it begins, figures assemble on stage and stand motionless, their faces covered by protective masks. They are members of the production team. Soon they are joined by chorus and cast in costume, all silent and masked, while their on-screen doubles continue to perform. This coup de théâtre, or is it a coup de vidéo, strikes me as an elegant and moving cry of protest at a moment when the reopening of theatres was still only a dream, when lives and livelihoods were threatened and institutions brought to their knees. In interview, Kolesnik takes the rhetoric of protest further, characterizing lockdowns as, quote, stupid and dangerous interventions that silence art when art is most needed. Make of that stance what you will. For my purposes, what is interesting here is a critique of media technology. The need for art, Kolesnik argued, is a need for, quote, something other than our mobile phones, unquote. When in-person performance gives way in this production to mediated performance, when voices become ventriloquized and performers start dialing in, as it were, we, watching and listening to the video production, don't necessarily register at first what has happened. Only slowly, as clues begin to emerge, do we become aware that, like Falstaff, we have been duped. What is the difference between a copy and a copy of a copy? The message of the stage production, reinforced by the video production, is that with digital media technology, you never really know. Still, for all its apparent suspicion, critique, and even resentment toward media technology, the Falstaff stream opens a door usually locked. It is an invitation, however begrudging, to the cameras and microphones to participate instead of observing, to perform instead of monitoring. A pity that it took these circumstances to unlock the door, and that the door shows signs of closing again. Close to, yeah. I fear that streamed relays now play a more prominent role in opera on screen, in opera online than ever, and the streams themselves are more conservative than ever. Why? I think, firstly, that the lifting of restrictions generated a backlash born of a new desire for in-person contact, for an older form of presence. The Opera House is back, and with it, those pale imitations, the live relays. Worse, I fear that initiatives based on in-house video production, something Livestream has facilitated, are actually turning the clock back to a televisual grammar that television and video actually left behind. Static mid-shots, a turgid editing pace, a lack of even the modest innovations that some multi-camera directors have explored fitfully. This is partly a matter of cost. Streaming stage production is cheap, and streaming in-house is the most cost-effective way to do that. Companies are falling over themselves to introduce streaming services of their own. It's not that they aren't aware of the limitations. One contributor to a panel at a recent annual Conference of Opera America, the umbrella organization of opera companies in North America, urged delegates to embrace the language of screen media and avoid what he calls the facsimile approach. And witness these sessions at the most recent Opera Europa conference, sessions on going beyond capture, for example, and there's a session after that on custom-made videos as well. They're trying, there's no doubt about it. But what an odd partnership between stage and screen this all is. Nearly 30 years ago, Jeremy Tambling reflected on the contradiction between the enduring ideal of contemplative spectatorship in the opera house and the state of distraction that video seemed to encourage when it flickered across TV screens or invited consumption in bite-sized chunks on DVD. What we encounter in the signature operatic media of our time, online streaming, seems no less incongruous. 4-hour performances can occupy a window on your laptop or pop up on your phone. Opera as TikTok video, opera as a glance available to the multi-screening spectator, yet relayed at great length in real time from the darkened and reverent opera house, where the conventions of attentiveness that embedded themselves in the 19th century still prevail. Unless opera is ready to rethink not just the idea of capture, but what is captured. Ready to rethink what happens there, what audiences are permitted to do there in the opera house. Now that would be a thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we'll move on to the next speaker. My small screen and our fearless leader have suggested that perhaps we have the question period at the end if there is time, so that we can remain more or less on schedule. But thank you very much for a very stimulating and, in my view, very moving presentation. Oops, so many microphones. And coming right up, our next speaker then is Emanuele Senici, who is professor of music history at the University of Rome La Sapienza. And last spring, he was the Leverhulme visiting professor in the music faculty of Cambridge University. His research centers on Italian opera of the long 19th century, on the theory and historiography of opera, especially issues of genre and gender, and on opera on video. His recent publications include a monograph, Music in the Present Tense, Rossini's Italian Operas in Their Time, that's from Chicago, 2019, and a co-edited book, Music, Place, and Identity in Italian Urban Soundscapes, circa 1550 to 1860, that's Routledge, 2023, and another co-edited collection, Vincenzo Bellini on Stage and Screen, 1935 to 2020, is forthcoming in 2024. Where is, oh, hi. Today he will present another paper having to do with the pandemic, the whole theater as the set, all of it. Decentering the Opera Experience in Pandemic Rome. Let's welcome Professor Senici.
Okay, let's see. I'm working on a Mac. So thank you. Fantastic, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Carol Hess for her generous introduction, to Pierpaolo and all his team for inviting us, for organizing our travels, and for welcoming us here at Davis. As you will see, my paper has a lot in common with Chris's that we have just heard. And yeah, I think hopefully there'll be a dialogue going. The Teatro dell'Opera di Roma is a rather peculiar entity, not least in its self-consciousness about its own peculiarity. Witness not only the rather muted rhetoric, but also the convoluted syntax of the initial sentence of the theater's description on its website. Oh, no. Sorry, got it wrong. Atypical, long, and troubled has been the path that has marked the Teatro dell'Opera di Roma from its birth to the prestige that has accompanied it to the present day. And now compare it to the self-confidently matter-of-fact tone of the equivalent sentence from the website of Milan's Teatro alla Scala. The Teatro alla Scala was built in 1776 over the ashes of a ducal theatre by will of Empress Maria Theresia of Austria and was inaugurated in 1778 with Antonio Salieri's Europa Riconosciuta. Here is the first among the many reasons for the Rome Opera's uneasy self-consciousness. Although it is the opera house of the Italian capital, it does not even remotely enjoy La Scala's reputation, and therefore its amount of public subsidy. How would that initial sentence read anyway if we rewrote it in the style of La Scala's? A considerably less glamorous, the Teatro dell'Opera di Roma was built in 1880 as Teatro Costanzi from the name of its private contractor who financed it, and was inaugurated with the revival of Rossini's 1823 Semiramide. I will have more to say about the self-perception and public standing of the Rome Opera later on. For the moment, it's fair to say that its reputation has widely fluctuated over time. Starting in 2013, however, when cultural manager Carlo Fuortes became its intendant, the Rome Opera has steadily improved its repute with a series of high-level productions. It did not come as a complete surprise then, when it rose to the challenge of the restrictions imposed on theaters by the COVID-19 pandemic, with a varied and substantial program of actions and events. Among the most prominent ones were, in July 2020, Verdi's Rigoletto performed on a temporary stage built within the Circus Maximus, directed by Damiano Micheletto and conducted by Daniele Gatti. The first performance was shown live on Rai 5, Rai 5, the culture TV channel of Rai, Italy's national public broadcaster. In December 2020, Rossini's Barbiere di Siviglia, a film opera, as it was officially called, directed by Mario Martone and conducted by Gatti, broadcast on Rai 3, a generalist Rai TV channel. In April 2021, another film opera broadcast on Rai 3, this time of Verdi's Traviata, also directed by Martone and conducted by Gatti. And a year later, in April 22, a third film opera by Martone, La Bohème, this time with Michele Mariotti in the pit, also broadcast on Rai 3. There were also danced films and mixed programs of arias and dance scenes shot in such renowned Roman landmarks as the Galleria Borghese and Palazzo Farnese of Tosca fame. All these films have been available for streaming on Rai Play, Rai Multimedia's internet portal, since shortly after their initial broadcast, and they've been retransmitted several times on Rai 5. What is perhaps most impressive about these programs is their diversity, not least because some were broadcast live, while others had been pre-recorded. Perhaps their single most distinctive feature is the variety of their locales, which includes several iconic Roman sites. As we will have surely noticed, I haven't yet mentioned the settings of the 3 film operas by Martone. They're going to be the main focus of the rest of my paper, because I believe that they invite reflection on a set of attitudes, beliefs, and emotions fundamental not only to the relationship between opera and life during the pandemic, but more broadly to the position of opera within urban imaginaries, especially in the context of mass tourism. As such, they constitute an obvious yet idiosyncratic set of decentering interventions that might help us think about the connections between opera and its localities. Martone's films are set in the Rome Opera itself. As Fuortes, the general director, explained during a TV interview a few days before the broadcast of Il Barbiere di Siviglia, this film has been conceived for the eye and the ear of the camera, not for the public, who is not present. The whole theater has been used as a set, all of it. Not just the stage, but also the stall, the boxes, the roll box, and other spaces. This was also true of La Traviata. Martone's third film, La Bohème, shown a year later, was staged instead in the ancillary building that hosts the company's set design studio, a former pasta factory located near the Circus Maximus. You can see up there Rome Opera near Termini Station, and down there the set design studio, right close to the Circus Maximus, the Colosseum, and so on. This unusual choice turns these films into instances of site-specific theater, but of a rather peculiar kind. When it comes to opera, the specificity of the sites chosen as settings usually consists in a more or less close connection between them and the locations of an opera's action, as specified in this libretto. Very close connection in the case of the best known of them all, the 1992 Tosca in the settings and at the times of Tosca, another Roman project, which is surely the main impulse behind the themed itinerary, quote unquote, through the places of Tosca offered by the official website of the city of Rome devoted to tourism. In other cases, the specificity of a site consists simply in not being a theater, but rather an unusual space, often unusually spectacular and also unusually challenging, such as a train station or a harbor, thinking of Zurich and Sydney in this case. In the case of Martone's three films, there is no evident connection between the settings of the three operas and the Teatro dell'Opera di Roma, nor is the building an unusually spectacular space, though using it, the whole of it, certainly presented certain challenges to operatic performance and its filming. The specificity of this site is instead closely connected to the COVID pandemic, during which and on account of which the films were conceived and produced. The building of the Teatro dell'Opera had always been the site specifically devoted to operatic experience, of course, but it was the pandemic that turned this specificity into the object of a desire suddenly unattainable and therefore so much more burning. At this point, I should admit that my remarks apply fully to the Barbiere and Traviata, but only partially to La Bohème, whose special case we can discuss later if you so wish. By using not just the stage, but also the stalls, the boxes, the roll box, and other spaces, to recall Fortes' words, Martone's film acknowledged this desire and built their visual, aesthetic, and emotional stance on it. This was an original, indeed, as far as I know, singularly creative idea during the pandemic period, not only in the Italian context, but worldwide, well, with a partial exception of the end of the full stuff that we just saw. Videos of operatic performances made when theaters were closed to the public were either shot on their stages or in entirely different locales, but not, as far as I've been able to ascertain, in the whole theatrical building and its annexes. In other words, the experience of going to a theater for an opera performance did not become the object of the videos themselves, as is the case in Martone's Roman films. It is all the more remarkable, then, that the theater in question is the Teatro dell'Opera di Roma, which is not only not La Scala, as I said earlier, but also, in the first instance, not the San Carlo, not La Fenice, not the Comunale, not the Massimo, not even the Regio, which turned 50 last year, or the Carlo Felice, only 33. All these theaters enjoy a much stronger distinctiveness, or at least recognizability, in the context of the operatic and cultural life of Italy. Among major Italian cities, only Florence fares worse than Rome in this respect. Long story, I won't go into detail. Horrible. They went from horrible to more horrible. But anyway. The Teatro dell'Opera di Roma has virtually no recognizable media presence in Italy, let alone abroad, at least visually. And for perfectly good reasons, since it is a rather problematic building, not only architecturally, but also ideologically. Located outside the city center and inaugurated only 10 years after Rome joined the fledgling Kingdom of Italy and became its capital, it was originally conceived as a popular alternative to the papal Teatro Argentina and Teatro Apollo, and hence it lacks the pedigree of the many older and aristocratic Italian theaters, La Scala, San Carlo, and many provincial theaters. In 1927, it was bought by Rome City Council and radically altered in an effort to make it the representative theater of the capital of the recently established fascist state. Though by chance, the rebuilding was entrusted to architect Marcello Piacentini, the most representative of the fascist ventennio, the 20 years that fascism lasted, and one of the most closely tied to Mussolini's regime. Among many other projects, he designed the campus of the institution where our gracious host obtained his first degree, La Sapienza. As a result of this intervention, which included the reorientation of the whole building and the new facade, it must surely now be the only opera theater to which you walk down, a feature that almost all photographs try to hide. In 1958, it was radically altered once more, again by Piacentini, who, among other things, remodeled the facade to the one we see today. Thus, the building's most evidently modernist rationalist trait, a style commonly associated in Italy with the fascist ventennio, was added 15 years after the fall of the fascist regime, which probably accounts for its relative timidity in this respect, as if Piacentini were trying to make it look a little less fascist than La Sapienza or his other fascist projects. The Teatro dell'Opera then also lacks the impeccable modernist credentials of Turin's Reggio or the postmodern ones of Genoa's Carlo Felice. The ceiling of the auditorium is decorated with a celebration of colonial conquests. The theater was inaugurated 9 years after the premiere of Aida, surely the main reference here. Note that Italy had no colonial presence to speak of in 1880. They just wrote opera about it, and then they decorated the ceiling of the theater. Italy's colonial enterprise came later. Finally, above the proscenium arch, a plaque commemorates the 1928 rebuilding with the following words. Ludovico Spada Potenziani, mayor of Rome, restored this theater in 1928, the 6th year of the fascist era, when Victor Emanuele III was king and Benito Mussolini dictator. In the light of all this, perhaps the relatively invisibility of the Rome Opera is not such a bad thing after all. Unable to show the actual experience of going to the theater to attend an opera performance, standing in the foyer, walking up and down the staircases, seeing the auditorium half empty before the show or at the interval, and so on, Martone's films exhibit instead the spaces where this experience usually takes place. In their attempt to take us as close as possible to this experience, however, they run the risk of glorifying and perhaps even fetishizing spaces that not only never acted as an object of longing before them, but are problematic from several perspectives. And what about the pasta factory anyway? Who even knew it existed, apart from a few fans of industrial archaeology? The pandemic time videos produced by the Rome Opera obviously try to take advantage of the cultural capital and mass tourist appeal of the city of Rome, just like the famous Tosca in the settings and at the times of Tosca back in '92, by going to the Circus Maximus, the Galleria Borghese, and Palazzo Farnese. But these videos are not about the operatic experience, like the three by Martone. In a city that ranks among the most intensely mediatized locales worldwide, this experience takes place instead in a space that has minimal media impact and therefore tourist appeal. What is more, Martone made an explicit gesture against the usual tourism-driven image of Rome during Figaro's Cavatina and Il Barbiere, staged as the barbers ride through the city on a scooter driven by Gatti, the conductor, one of the very few outdoor sequences in these films, which Martone uses for the opening credits. This sequence establishes an evident intertextual relationship with the famous Vespa ride through Rome in William Wyler's 1953 rom-com Roman Holiday, which takes the two characters interpreted by Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck to a number of iconic Roman sites, such as the Colosseum, Trinità dei Monti, Piazza Venezia, the Appian Way, and so on. But this reference highlights, by contrast, Martone's studious avoidance of any such site. He keeps instead to unmarked streets and piazzas, like those seen by any Roman driving to work in the morning and having to negotiate traffic, roadworks, and all the other usual sources of stress during their daily commute. Evidently, during the pandemic, it was not only the experience of attending a live opera that was considered so important as to make an opera film about it, overcoming the multiple limitations of the space in which such experience usually took place before the pandemic itself. Even the daily commute to work by scooter, very common in Rome, was filmed as an object of desire. But the desire for the opera-going experience is also fundamental to another crucial respect in which Martone's films differ not only from all the other videos made by the Rome Opera, but also from the vast majority of opera videos that do not capture live on-stage performances. These films, mostly feature live playing and singing. What is more, they thematize their liveness, making it a prominent subject of their representational strategies, as will become obvious from a short excerpt near the beginning of La Bohème. As this excerpt demonstrates, Martone's films make their liveness a prominent subject of their visual representation, but there are some that favors closeness of sound source and tends to avoid acknowledging the aural qualities of the space in which voices and instruments resound. Rodolfo shouts Eureka because he pretends he has eventually seen the source of the orchestral sound, not because this source has been acknowledged sonically. What Martone's films celebrate then is the visual experience of going to the opera, not the aural one, despite their mise-en-scène of liveness. We might for a moment believe we are there, but only if we shut our ears. Perhaps to nothing as much as desperately I want to say, as to the deafening silence that follows the end of Barbiere, made all the more upsetting by the sounds of steps and then of chatting that slowly come to the fore. When this was first broadcast in 2020, I welled up at this final scene. I was so emotional. It's completely different looking at it now. You know, I just started crying. It was all this liberation of the theater, you know, and cutting the ropes. Anyway, there will be much more to say about the aural strategies of these films and their interaction with the visual ones, especially in the context of pandemic soundscapes, as well as about the synecdochic relationship that they promote between the theater buildings and the city of Rome. Another time. As for conclusions, several considerations suggest themselves, but my time is up and I must be brief. It seems to me that Martone's three films invite us to reconsider what it means to attend an opera performance, or better, what it means to represent on video the attendance to an opera performance, as they implicitly critique the ways in which such attendance has been constructed by standard videos of operatic performances in theaters, for example, by the Met Live in HD Enterprise, and there are all sorts of echoes with Chris's paper here. However, even if they were not broadcast live, these films go out of their way to emphasize that most of the time, images and sounds were captured live on set, that bodies and voices were not split, as is usually the case in opera films, and that everybody involved in the performance was actually there, that this performance was real, co-present, authentic, even if we could not be there to experience it co-presently, so to speak. João Pedro Cachopo has recently written of a few experimental pandemic time operatic performances, some captured on video, that these productions reimagine the operatic form by blurring the boundary between liveness and remediation, by radicalizing the interpretative and creative context of performance, and by challenging the myth of medium specificity. Their merit, which transcends the solutions they advance, consists in the questions they raise about the musical theatrical genre, questions that unsettle our perception not only of the social role of opera, but also of its very mediality and its relation to other arts. I'm not sure I can make quite the same claims for Martone's Roman films, but I would want to suggest that they also raise similar questions about the social role of opera, both live and on video, and its mediality. More than anything, they question the spaces where it is consumed, the nature of our emotional investment in them, both before and during the pandemic, and what this investment might mean for the spaces themselves. If site-specific performances, in the words of Mike Pearson and Michael Shanks, thank you to Chris for the quote, the latest occupation of a location at which other occupations, their material traces and histories are still apparent, if site is not just an interesting and disinterested backdrop, then what happens to the site after a performance specific to it is videoed and broadcast when the site itself is inaccessible. How is this site produced by the performance? Is video and the audience is watching it? And what remains of these acts of production after the exceptional circumstances that produced them? Might they, in their small way, help getting rid of that effing memorial plaque? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand we'll take about a few minutes for questions. We're also waiting for the coffee to show up. Did it come yet? It did not yet come. So we have all this time that we can ask questions of any of the speakers, but perhaps Professor Senici may get the first question. Yes. Oh, sorry.
I could ask. Thank you all for these conversations. My question actually goes to the last two speakers, perhaps, because I know during the pandemic, for me and my husband, we watched a lot of the Met broadcasts, and particularly because they weren't playing the videos in chronological order, we really sort of noticed the sonic differences on how things were mic'd between the older ways, the older videos and the newer videos. And it didn't seem that it was only because of technology, but it was like the choice on the way the Met was miking. And I think a similar question could be, would you all think about the choices of technology versus the choices that these houses make or these videos make of technology versus what's available to them? Because I think there seems to be an aesthetic and artistic choice, and also perhaps even a cultural choice, as we're used to pop music and music videos and having the different types of ways that things are filmed. So I'd love to know what you both think about that.
Thank you. I think Chris is the best person to answer this question. I mean, I can say something later, but you should go first.
Body mics, right? Radio microphones. They produce a focused, intimate sound. They're absolutely critical to producing the balanced but intimate sound that is increasingly favored, and I think possibly increasingly favored for reasons you've hinted at, which has to do with the aesthetics of popular music and the voice in popular music. But there are a couple of issues. One has to do with how expensive it is to have a coordinator who also has to be an intimacy coordinator about fitting mics. Also, singers are on record repeatedly as saying they hate them. They hate them because they remind them of a different mode. They encourage them to sing differently. And so that's a really... So I actually think it's a bit of a cultural battlefield at the moment, pitting different actors within the overall economy of opera against one another.
Yeah. Just to add that listeners are very aware of this, especially when video is not involved. I waste too much of my time on Parterre Box, the online, yeah, and they do listening parties, live listening parties. And a recurrent observation is about the miking. We can hear the singers breathe. We can hear, when they draw in, and the debate is ongoing. In Italy, you have different Rai troops. The one that does La Scala, the one that does Rome, the one that does Milan, and listeners compare them, saying, the guys in Milan, they know nothing. I mean, we can hear everything, single detail. Listen to the guys down in Naples. They know how to mic and how to blend. I mean, it's a live mixing, of course. So it's listeners or expert listeners are very, very aware of this. But there are all sorts of other considerations,
And the producers, the audio producers at the Royal Opera have some not very nice things to say about the Met. They don't think they know how to record sound well. And so there's an interesting to and fro. And one other thing, it goes out, the Met Live in HD goes out in surround sound, but that's fake. It's actually stereo. Whereas the Royal Opera actually broadcasts in surround sound. That has ramifications when you're in the cinema. It could even have ramifications if you have a system at home that can decode surround sound.
Are you sure AI isn't in charge?
AI is always in charge.
I think we had a question for Professor Levy. Did we get asked?
Yeah, thank you. If that's okay. It was just a very simple question. The 2009 clips that you were showing, maybe this is a cultural response. I'm not sure if Imani sort of was also responding about knowing about this. Why would it be restaged, given, sorry, maybe this is just my own cultural response, given that perhaps that style is out of favour? It looked like someone had it's fascinating, but yeah, why? Or what are the contexts behind it being okay to be? Yeah, I don't know if that's put correctly, but yeah.
So the short answer is that I don't know, but it does seem to have been spearheaded by local figures with a strong connection to the club. I'm sure that that's where they got the performance materials and how they came to know of it. But it's unlike the original club performance. Obviously, it's a mixed gender staged performance. So I think it was a lark. I think it was just a lark on the part of the rich, and documented as such. So they go into great detail about the building of the set and what can happen on the cruise ship and so forth. So it's very uncanny and still just as distant, I think, from or almost as distant from any sense of public as the original. It may be a middle ground. They do a lot of audience interviews at the end of the video, but I think they have to be the friends of the folks. I don't know if tickets were sold or not, so there's much I don't know.
Our fearless leader has a question.
Yeah, fearful. I have a question for Chris and Emanuele about the rituals of listening during the pandemics. I don't know if there is any metrics or any perception of how global it was, meaning, I remember myself, like I would watch opera and San Francisco opera, but never opera in London or in Berlin. And I wonder if people in Berlin actually liked their own opera theater, even though they could have access to many other opera theaters. So false decentralization,
I only have metrics from OperaVision, so that's EU-funded streaming platform run by Opera Europa, and they had a huge spike in viewing figures during the pandemic, not only quantitative but in reach. So the number of countries, the number of hits they got, and the diversity of the countries increased substantially during the pandemic. But you're asking a question, I think, that requires further research. I think I think that interest, that question of the local and just what sort of national versus international reach these streams had, it's not clear. Some of them were geo-blocked, so that's an issue.
Just to add, I mean, this is a huge topic, but is that we have to keep in mind whether something was broadcast on television or available for online viewing. Television is, heaven knows what television is doing these days in general, and in relation to opera as well. Is he alive? Is he dying? Dead? Who knows? But in Italy, these opera films that we're talking about were broadcast at 9 p.m. on a weekend evening, and that, especially I would imagine a certain viewers of a certain age, more used to the rituals of television viewing, would sit down in front of the TV, and that's your virtual community. If they are streamed online, and especially if you can comment during the online streaming, that's another completely different set, even I'd say, of in terms of age, the younger versus older public.
And Opera Vision have actually employed the services of a YouTuber to create watch parties for video broadcast, and those include live chat and so on. So that's become an issue of its own, and relates to the broader genre of reaction videos, which is a huge phenomenon and needs a lot of work, especially since a lot of reaction videos are focused on music.
I suggest we take one more question. It was just suggested to me that even if the coffee hasn't yet arrived, some people might want to stand up, and we can always bring our coffee in for our keynote. But it turns out our keynote speaker also has a question. Sorry, so I have one final question.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. My goodness, this is such an interesting topic. All these papers have been, but particularly with this last two, I just wanted to bring a couple of comments together. Most of us think of the pandemic and opera as a very emotional, sad time, and I appreciate you're saying like watching it again, but this really is a thing, opera during the pandemic and what it meant as a genre. You opened with this issue of Hamilton as a musical, and that's when I saw it because I couldn't afford to see it with my family. And sort of the operatic elements in that, which is another conversation. Sound, and as we talk about decentering opera, one of the big things when people ask me, what's an opera, what's a musical? One of the things I used to think was how the sound comes across. Ideally, in my old-fashioned views that I'm rethinking, maybe I thought opera was very acoustic, where I could follow the singer when I'm in the house. Yet when I go to the Met at the movies, they're HD, that's totally twisted and it's freaky to me. Also what I get to see and how I'm used to choosing what I see. So the use of sound, the use of mics, a whole area I don't even know about with body mics, this idea of nation, because when all this was happening in the pandemic, we were just figuring it out. I was thrilled that opera was available. I didn't know that Germany, the Bayerische and Stadttheater and Covent Garden, and I don't even know if the Roma, if that was available, the RAI channels were available in Michigan or here in the US. So it's just this intertwining of so many things that now we can think about in retrospect, but this was a huge thing for seeing opera and what it meant. So I just wanted to say, when initially I thought, oh God, yeah, more on the pandemic and opera, it's like, oh no, this is really important. So thank you.
That's a good note on which to end this session. Thank you to all three speakers, and as if on cue, the coffee has appeared, so we can all go get some.